down on those. Well, let's take a look at what that's going to mean, because first of all, the Strait of Hormuz, even though the United States Central Command lies every day in saying that the Strait of Hormuz is open, we have very practical, concrete evidence that that's a complete lie. No, hardly anything is traveling through the Hormuz, especially on our path here. More concerning, especially if we go back into these strikes here, is on our Patriot expenditures. So we see that the Iranian side, despite all of our vaunted Patriot and THAAD air defense systems, whatever, most of the shots are getting through, and they are precise hits by the Iranian side. Then when you look at those, this is really important here. This is going to tail into something you published recently. America is firing Patriot interceptors at more than 100 times faster than we can build them. 11 straight nights of American strikes, now 12. And Iranian missile drones still reach Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. U.S. intelligence assessment reported by the Washington Post concluded that the bombing is unlikely to move Tehran at all. And then the underlying math is what matters. During the first 4 days of this war, coalition forces expended Patriot rounds at roughly 225 per day, while Lockheed's facility produces 1.7, consumption ratio of 132-1. And that immediately made me think of this piece that you've recently published on your Substack, Trump's war to the last missile. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about what that reveals based on some of the information we just posted?
Well, when I wrote this, I wrote it to get the point across to people that we could run out of missiles long before Iran does. In fact, we could end up not being able to provide any of our strategic partners or friends any missiles at all. We're already stripping out much of the world's missile inventories and shipping them to the Middle East. This is not going to end well for us. We're simply going to look impotent in the eyes of the world. And if you admit that your bombing strategy or your air and missile strategy isn't working, that you're not hitting the right targets, which is always the essence of the promise of success for air and missile campaigns, well, then it suggests that you're nearing the end of your inventory. And what do you do when you have no more missiles to fire? Harry Kazianis wrote a great piece where he tried to explain this. Now, when back in the early, at 2001, 2, 3, and 4, before I left the Army, I must tell you that there were people in Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, who were making the argument in private that they cannot surge. Now, during World War II, everybody says, well, look what we did during World War II. Well, the government poured in billions of dollars to help somebody like Henry Ford build this mile-long assembly line so that we could turn out thousands of aircraft very, very rapidly. And they perfected it, and they did it. We haven't had anything like that occur. In other words, there has been no focused investment to get the kind of surge capacity that you need if you fight. Now, the Russians realized they were in a difficult position back in 2022 when they moved into Ukraine, and they discovered, my God, this force is much larger and more dangerous than even we thought. And then they captured the plans and saw that they wanted to use that force against them in a place like Crimea, not just in Donetsk, Luhansk, and so forth. So what did they do? They focused their investment, they focused their attention, their manpower, everything on the scientific industrial base so that they could rapidly turn out the weapons and the missiles they need. And, you know, Alex Vershinin has written about this, about the criticality of an industrial base if you're going to fight an industrial war. And we're involved in an industrial war. But what we lost sight of was that it's a war of missiles and unmanned systems, specifically these relatively inexpensive Shahad drones and others. That's a little different from what we anticipated. We have satellites. We can build a similar ISR strike capability, but we don't have the vast numbers of missiles and drones that we need. But we do have a lot of other things. Unfortunately, a lot of the other things that we have aren't terribly useful. So this is not news, but it's a reality that we have to deal with. The smart thing to have done when we realized we were in this position was to get out of this and go home and get back on the drawing board, re-examine what we were doing, what we would need. But we didn't do that. Instead, we're doubling down on failure. And so you're going to get a double failure. You're going to get failure militarily, strategically in the Persian Gulf against Iran, matched by strategic failure at home, financially, economically. I can't think of a worse set of circumstances for any great power in the history of mankind.
And Doug, it's also that reality. All these things you just be talking about are clearly evident to the Iranian side, because they have discovered that they could weather everything that we could throw at them for 40 days. They could weather this blockade, and now they're kind of weathering a combination of both, and they're able to succeed and hit us through it. And that kind of leads to some confident statements from like their foreign minister Araghchi here, who says, listen, here's our current situation. This is as of yesterday afternoon. Any aggression against Iran, including our infrastructure, will compel a powerful and decisive response. Our defense doctrine is clear: an eye for an eye. Those who contribute to such aggression, whatever kind of support, will also be considered as legitimate targets. And of course, there he's talking about our regional allies. Now, when the Americans look at that, instead of coming to the conclusion you just did about, all right, all this stuff has failed, let's don't do that again. Let's do something different and reevaluate. Instead, Marco Rubio says, yeah, about his comments.
Guys, I saw Araghchi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price. You guys don't know it because you don't cover it. You're not in Iran. You're not in the street. They don't have a free media. But they're going to continue to pay a very heavy price. Their industrial base has been decimated. Their defense industrial base has been decimated. They're losing launchers. They're losing radars every single night. They are suffering billions of dollars in damage, and their economy is a disaster. But despite all that, okay, these people who are calling us every day, begging, let's do a deal, they send us messages through other countries, third countries. I mean, they're running out of countries to send. Even I had countries here coming up to me, oh, I just spoke to the Iranians, they want to do a deal. The problem is, every time these people do a deal, they either break it, or after they make it, they want to change the deal.
Yeah, Doug, I don't think there's hardly anything he said that's accurate or true there. What do you make of it?
Well, the first thing is that, as far as I can tell, no one in Iran is beating the drum for peace. I think if you look at the situation in Iran today, whatever opposition existed to the current regime is either suspended or vanished. The nation is united, and the political actors in the country are united in their opposition to any sort of arrangement with us that would end this war on any terms other than those that you saw in the 14 points. So those 14 points remain on the table. I don't see the Iranians backing off of that at all. So I think that's the first part. The second part is that if you have to tell the American people day after day after day after day that you are winning, and you argue, we've hit this many targets and we've destroyed this many buildings and so forth, what you're really telling the American people is this is endless. And Americans are beginning to say, if you have to tell us you're winning all the time, we're beginning to think you aren't. And I think that's already happening. People, are we winning? Because we're back to what's the objective? And the objective is Israel's desire to destroy Iran. Remember when we started this, we started with the notion that a little bit of regime change would provoke the resistance to stand up and overthrow the government. That went away fairly quickly. Having failed at that, what do we do next? Well, we're going to destroy their military capability. That hasn't worked. Their military capability is at least 70% of what it was before, and probably better, because they have some new weapons and new missiles they didn't have before. They continue to manufacture material. And they have the backing of China and Russia, particularly China, with its satellite connectivity, its communications, and so forth. So this is, if you have to keep saying this, it's not working. And I think that's pretty obvious. The bad news is this: we're trying to do two things at once. And this really began, I must say, under the Biden administration. This is not Trump's invention. The Biden administration started out backing this pointless and stupid and destructive war in Ukraine against Russia because it decided it was going to make the fight for the retention of American military, political, and financial hegemony in the world in Ukraine. That has failed. And then in the meantime, the war in the Middle East started up. And given its obligations to the Israel lobby and the people in the administration who are effectively agents for Israel, they had no choice but to join the war that Israel is waging on its neighbors. That then morphed into what we see today. Both wars are linked in that sense. We're not going to reverse the developments now. We're not going to stop Iran from being successful. We're not going to stop the Russians from crushing Ukraine. Those times are over. However, and this is something we got to address, and that is, if everything you do has failed, if there is nothing you can do with what you have on the table, there is a willingness to turn to something else, and that's where we go to a nuclear weapon. We're not going to use bioweapons. Bioweapons are simply uncontrollable. You have no real control over where those things go and what they do. Have as much damage to us as it will to any enemy. That's not going to be on the table. But the nuclear weapon is different. Israel has nuclear weapons, and Israel has made it very clear that it will use those if it feels it's necessary to do so. If everything else fails, I'm concerned that the Israelis will turn to something like that. And that, of course, changes everything.
Well, it does. And then I mean, you can't talk about the Russia-Ukraine war without being concerned about that on any number of fronts, possibly even ours, especially if things start going south. Marco Rubio was not just in the Middle East. He was also talking, I think, at that same forum in the Philippines. He was talking to Sergei Lavrov and talking about that. You talked about that there's no seeming movement to get out of that. Well, the official readout of that's very interesting. This is as of today. Merely says that they talked, they discussed U.S.-Russia relationships and the need to end the Russia-Ukraine war. But they didn't say anything about why. Media, on the other hand, is saying the U.S. is ready to help end the senseless war in Ukraine, but no quick deal is ahead, Rubio says. And then looking over on the Russian side, Dmitry Peskov said this about any hopes for a resolution in the near term.
In this situation, I wouldn't be overly optimistic. Contacts are indeed taking place. That is always positive. But one cannot speak of any new dynamics or acceleration right now. We continue our dialogue with the Americans through existing working channels, and we hope that when the American negotiators are freer, we will continue in-person communication. They will be able to come to Moscow and continue our dialogue.
But meanwhile, like Russia has always done, they're going to continue to fight. And the air war has really stepped up. It has now expanded into the sea world. There are a number of Russian ships have been hit in the Sea of Azov, but Russia, as they always do, strikes back harder against shipping. And now a good portion of the port system in Odessa for Ukraine has been shut down because they can't endure that. And there's all kinds of strikes along the operational depths of the front line. At the front line, Russia continues to move up. They have recently taken Konstantinivka. They're now moving up to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the last two fortress cities that are left there in the Donbass area, etc. And as you were telling me before that we came on the air here, there is another development tactically, or at least operationally, for the Russians on the battlefield. What is that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, let's keep something in mind. Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran have all learned a very hard lesson with us. And that is that you cannot believe anything President Trump says or anything that anyone in his administration says. That's where we are right now. So there can be no arrangement, no agreement of any kind with Russia at this point on Ukraine. How many times do you meet and how many times do you listen to Donald Trump say, well, I'll do this and we'll do that and we'll hammer this out and we'll put an end to this, only to discover that he goes home, he does a 180-degree turn and does the opposite of what was said. This happened in Alaska. I think Alaska was the last serious attempt to try and reach some sort of agreement, and they've given up. That they'll be happy to talk to us or at least sit there and listen to us bloviate, but nobody trusts us. And that's very bad, because if nobody trusts us in the Middle East and nobody trusts us in Eastern Europe, you're not going to get any financiers or lenders to go back into these areas to rebuild anything, to reconstruct anything, because they don't trust anything we say, specifically when it comes to ending the conflict. They're afraid that if they go in and do anything, the next week Donald Trump will decide, well, I'm renewing the bombing campaign because I don't like X, Y, and Z. We're in a very difficult position there. Now, this man, General Surovikin, is not well known to many in the West. He should be. He's a very intelligent man, very sharp, He was instrumental in putting together the larger strategic response in Ukraine to the Ukrainian threat once they consolidated control over most of what they were initially interested in, those Russian-speaking areas. He's an Air Force officer. He understands all of the various strike systems and how to use them, and how to orchestrate them. He understands the criticality of those links from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the air and in space to all of those weapons platforms. He understands that we are in a world today where the strikes shape the battlefield for ground forces. In other words, the ground force doesn't wait for the strikes to lift and then move. The strikes are much more profound, much more influential. He is part of the group that has felt for some time that the war has gone too slowly, that it is being too cautious. He was harmed because of his public statements supporting Prigozhin. People will forget Prigozhin. He was the one that led this whole charge to Moscow, trying to get President Putin's attention. He's now gone the way of the buffalo. And Surovikin was punished by being sent to Africa, where he's done excellent work for the Russians in Africa. What I'm trying to say is that this is a very different personality with a different view of the battlefield and how to do things. I expect he's going to have a significant impact. And he is going to definitely finish the job up in Kharkov. And I think we will then see movement towards Odessa. And eventually, I think we will see the Ukrainians cleared completely from the area of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. I'd be surprised if that didn't happen before long. This is not somebody who is uncertain, undecided, or what I would call extremely cautious. Quite the opposite. Now,
I wonder if you can address a little bit to kind of give us of how his generalship compares to what the West is, because he's not overly cautious, but he is. It appears anyway, from what he did while he was actually actively involved, is that he is patient. Though, for example, he took decisions that nobody else in the West or Ukraine would do in 2022, when he made a calculation that to try and hold the city of Kherson, which Russian had at the time, it was going to be too costly. So he withdrew from the city, moved back across the Dnieper River, blew the 4 bridges, and that basically stopped the Ukrainians. They never went beyond that. Meanwhile, he set up these 5, what they ended up calling the 5 Surovikin lines of the defense, which were completely successful at breaking the teeth of the 2023 attack from the Ukrainian side. And no, we can just be left to wonder what would have happened if he had remained in, because of the Prigozhin affair. He went out. Now that he's back, what does his previous attacks tell you about what he may do next?
Well, first of all, you're right. He made the correct assessment to let us and our Ukrainian proxy overreach. We overreached. 1 million casualties resulted. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost pointlessly. Think of what happened after Kursk, because when you describe Kursk, Kursk was set up initially over the objections of Stalin. Stalin wanted to attack. That's something he had in common with Hitler. They were both obsessed with attacking each other, and he was talked out of it. And I wrote a chapter in the book Margin of Victory about it, which people might want to glance at. If you look at what happened at Kursk, that's what happened to the Ukrainians. Instead of Germans, it happened to Ukrainians. Now, what you're going to see is what happened after Kursk. And what was that? Well, they moved west. But they're not going to move west the way they did initially after the fall of Stalingrad. And they're not going to move west after Kursk the way they did exactly during World War II. It'll be much more deliberate, much more methodical, but it will be devastating. And you will see an integration of air and missile power with ground combat power on a scale that you have not seen yet. That's the best I can do.
Well, that's what most in the West don't believe is even possible. In fact, many people that I've queried here in Washington, D.C. just think that, no, what we've seen Russia do since 2023, since that offensive failed and taking so-called 1.5%, whatever it's been, That's because that's all they can do, and that's all they'll ever do. So this is basically a frozen conflict. It's a stalemate, and yeah, there's lots of contact along the line, but it's not going to ever go anywhere. So we can just take our time. As a matter of fact, we saw just I guess earlier this week an announcement that Germany and UK are consorting to have this new missile defense capacity, a missile offensive capacity, to where they'll create longer range missiles for use by Ukraine into Russia up to the year 2034 is before all that stuff's going to come out. But they're thinking long term that the war is just going to continue grinding on until later on they're going to be able to hit Russia even harder. What do you think about what that number one, will that work from the European side? And secondly, whether it does or not, what is the message to Russia today that they're moving that direction?
Well, remember, you had large numbers of people that told everyone Iran will fall apart. It'll collapse after 3 or 4 days. In fact, if you go back through many of General Keene's interviews and others, they dismissed it out of hand and said, well, this will be over a few days. Then it was a week. Then it was 2 weeks. And then suddenly it was, well, this is going to take longer. Now people in Washington, believe it or not, are talking about a stalemate that could last into next year. Now, I don't see that occurring for the reasons we've already discussed. I think it'll break down before then. But this is Washington, D.C. It's a bubble. People do not live in the world of reality. They live in a fantasy world. And that fantasy world extends to Russia. Russia is still, in their minds, something that it is not, a backward, developing country that can't possibly compete with a Western military power like the United States. So when it comes to Britain and France, they are dangerously out of touch with reality. Not only can they not build any sort of air and missile defense in any time that would make any difference, that takes years and an enormous investment, and it won't work until we break the laws of fractal mathematics and relate light, gravity, and magnetism, frankly. You can create point defense and clusters, but you're not going to defend vast territories. So that's one problem. Now they want to give more weapons to Ukraine. And I think there is a real risk of two things happening. First of all, I think with Surovikin there, it may be very hard to get those missiles into the country. I think you're going to see bridges over the Dnieper, rail lines, communications lines, all destroyed, that unto now have been untouched. And we can go into, in some future point in time, what the thinking was in Moscow that left those things intact. But I think he'll go after those with a vengeance. And then the other thing is they have built up these Oreshnik missiles with conventional munitions. And I think they're prepared to use them if they have to against NATO states that are hosting construction factories, whatever you want to call them, sites for missiles. I think that's their last option, but it's real and we shouldn't dismiss it and we should be concerned about it.